Hello, my name is André Simões, and I am associate professor at the University of São Paulo, Brazil. And it's an honor to me to take part in the international workshop on advances in cleaner production. And I will present to you my work, which the title is Energy, Climate Change, and Social Inequalities in Brazil, Reflections in the Context of the Pandemic of COVID-19. Our references. So it's important to highlight that declining the consumption of fossil fuels in the context of the quarantines and lockdowns around the globe caused a sharp reduction in economic activity in all countries around the globe. At the same time, that has been globally a decline in the consumption of fossil fuels, in particular oil and its derivatives, namely gasoline, diesel oil, jet fuel, and fuel oil. In case of Brazil, this picture was also relevant. As a result, in particular, due to the global contingency in the transport sector and the related very relevant reduction in the consumption of liquid petroleum fuels, the consequence of this situation, the GHG emissions have declined, mainly in the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic. But the situation of Brazil is a little bit different because of the deforestation in Amazon. I'll talk about it later. Brazil railway system, we can say that we don't have a railways comparing of our high network of road and highway system. So the consequence of the pandemic was cause a high reduction in terms of the consumption of gasoline and diesel oil so this is Brazil in the global map, Brazil in South America. If you look into specifically to the state of São Paulo, which responds for 33% of the Brazilian GDP in 2019 was closer to $2 trillion. The state of São Paulo responds for 33% of this GDP, Brazilian GDP. And if you look mainly only to the city of São Paulo, the city of São Paulo responds for 10 or 11% of the Brazilian GDP. I'm showing this figure to you to show our dependence from road, highways, so our dependence from car, buses, and trucks in our transport system. So this situation has consequences in terms of our energy consumption. The economic activity in Brazil is concentrated in the Southeast region. We have also another kind of economic activity in all Brazilian states, but is the Brazilian economic activity, the Brazilian GDP is concentrated in the South and Southeast regions, but mainly in the Southeast regions and mainly in the state of São Paulo, the state of Rio de Janeiro, and the state of Minas Gerais. In Brazil, a very interesting situation if you compare Brazil with the world average in terms of domestic energy supply, we can see clear the high participation of renewable energies in Brazil. It's very interesting, and it's a natural condition which explain the not so important level of CO2 emissions per capita, for example. It's a natural condition which implies in Brazil a not so important country in terms of GHG emissions. If you look for the size of the country, if you look for the Brazilian GDP, and if you look for the Brazilian population, Brazil are closer to 120 million people in the country. So if you look for the world average, the energy supply is very different. If you look to the world average in terms of electricity meters in Brazilian, same situation. Similar situation. We have here important participation of hydroelectric power plants, biomass plants, and also good news in terms of fighting against climate change, growing participation of wind power and solar power, mainly in the wind farms in northeast region of the country. If you look for the wind power, for example, wind power nowadays responds for more than 10% of the Brazilian electricity production. In looking for the Latin America, Brazil is the top one country in terms of GHG emissions, of course, because of our characteristics, the size, and the sector, the main sector in Brazil in terms of the CO2 GHG emissions are land use change and forestry, agriculture, and the growing use of fossil fuels in energy production, thermoelectric power plants, for example, mainly coal and natural gas. If you look for compare Brazil CO2 emissions per capita, you can see clearly that Brazil is not so important. Brazilian population because we use a lot of renewable energy, as I told you. But Brazil is an important country in terms of CO2 emissions. But last year, completely different from the many countries. If you look for the top 10 countries in terms of GHG emissions and CO2 emissions, of course, Brazil completely different because the situation of the country, if you look for the most important countries in terms of CO2 emissions, at least in 2017, Brazil was not between the 10 most important. Brazil is closer to South Africa, Indonesia, and Mexico, and Canada. But the situation changed because the deforestation last year in Amazon. But let's look for the road situation. The decline in terms of liquid fuels production and consumption is being reversed in the current 2021. The recovery of the economic road is building in terms of a high use dependence of coal, natural gas, and also liquid fuel oil products like gasoline and diesel. It's not good news, of course, in terms of fight against the avoiding the consequences, the worst consequence of climate change. We saw interesting the similar situation that we are seeing in the current 2021 and the energy history, the recent of at least 100 years of history of energy consumption and the demand in the world. The Spanish flu, aftermath of the Spanish flu, a high consumption, a growing important energy demand. After World War, after Great Depression, first oil shock, second oil shock, global financial crisis, the same situation. The rate of change in global primary energy demand show that after an important trouble, big trouble, a crisis, nowadays we are facing economic crisis, sanitary crisis, health crisis, we saw the recovery of the economic, the activity was based in high use of energy and fossil fuels energy, not renewable energy. Of course, not a good news in terms of avoid the worst consequence and avoid the fighting against climate change and mitigate climate change. The daily CO2 emissions, you can see clear the important part caused by COVID-19 in terms of CO2 emissions is, of course, is a good news. In looking for the Brazilian situation, the month, sorry, it's in Portuguese, this graph, but if you look at this official graph, if you look for the monthly gasoline sales in Brazil, very clear, very easy to see that we can here, 2020, 2021, April, May, June, July, we saw very clear a reduction in the sales of gasoline, and of course, also consequence, the reduction in terms of consumption of gasoline in Brazil. But 2021, this color here, we can see the situations completely changing, returning to the previous situation here, the last 5 years. We can see the similar situation in terms of diesel. We can see very clearly in April, May, June, July, an important reduction in the sales of diesel, and of course, in terms of consumption of diesel compared to 2020 and 2021. If you really reduce the contribution of Brazil in terms of climate change, Brazil should build more and more, take care more clear, more attention to the subnational policy, because Brazil is a big country. As you know, almost all Europe, discounting Russia, can be put in a hypothetical situation, of course, in the Brazilian territory. But if you try to fight against climate change, looking for the Brazilian situation, putting Brazil in the reference, we need to build completely different policies. If you are, for example, in the state of if you are governor of the state of Pará here in the North region, we need to you need to take care mainly of the society, of course, not the governor, to the land use change and forest. But if you are in northeast region, for example, in the state of São Paulo, state of Rio de Janeiro, Espírito Santo, Minas Gerais, we need to take care and build subnational policies focused in mitigate GHG emissions, but you need to look to take care of completely different sectors. For example, you need to, here in the São Paulo or Rio de Janeiro, take care about the energy sector, industrial process, and waste. So Brazil is a big country. It's not so easy to build up a national policy. We need necessary to build also and put more value in subnational policies. In most countries, GHG emissions have fallen due to the COVID-19, causing the level of global GHG emissions in 2020 about 7 lower than in 2019. But it's, however, a cyclical drop. And it's necessary to remember that to avoid 1.5 Celsius degree before 2050, looking to the Paris Agreement, this punctual reduction must be a little higher than mentioned 7%. And for all the next decade and more, besides GHG concentration is in the atmosphere is different from GHG emissions. Of course, the cumulative effect explain this. The bad news, of course, the cumulative effect preventing a slowdown in climate change, even in the COVID-19 pandemic. Also, the bad news also, the level of global GHG emissions in 2021 tends to exceed that was observed in 2019. In Brazil, however, a trend opposite the world average was observed in 2020 with an increase in the country's net GHG emission due to deforestation, mainly in the Amazon rainforest, but not only in the Amazon rainforest. It's important to say now the growing number of fires in Pantanal, another so important Brazilian biome. In Brazil, GHG emissions comparing 2020 with 2019 increased by about 90.5%. However, without a direct relationship with the COVID-19 pandemic. Unlike what happens in other parts of the world, most of the Brazil's GHG emissions come from changes in land use, 44%. And as I told this, the decrease in other sectors such as energy generation and transport was not enough to offset the increase in CO2 emissions due to deforestation. Another important sector in terms of GHG emissions is the methane. We have here in Brazil, we have more heads of cattle in Brazil than people. 230 million heads of cattle than comparing with 215. It's an important issues is necessary to deal with the situation. The central causes in Brazil of this high and growing deforestation in Brazil, illegal timber trafficking, advances of the frontier for agriculture and cattle raising, often illegally, and actually the Brazilian government is denial and not very combative in face of environment crimes. The forestation in indigenous territories is growing. The legal Amazon is growing. That's a terrible news because when you are in the land, indigenous land, very probably you can find an important forest cover. You can find an indirect relation between indigenous land and deforestation. It's also important, completely important, to preserve indigenous land, to preserve the indigenous culture, the culture of the Indians, and to build a real Brazil to the future, consider all the contribution, all cultures here present, even before the reach of the Portuguese society in the Middle Age, the end of the Middle Age. The advance of deforestation in Amazon, the largest tropical forest in the world. Here's where is the other important tropical forest in the world, may imply, looking for the high level of deforestation, the growing deforestation in Brazil, in the Amazon, may imply that the possible next zoonoses can occur here in Brazil, can be embryonic here in Brazil. Since the beginning of the Bolsonaro, what really means Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil nowadays, is called Jair Bolsonaro. What really means Bolsonaro's administration, the government Bolsonaro, for Brazilian climate politics. In these days, Brazil is is working with another countries in COP26 in Scotland. Since the beginning of Bolsonaro's administration, January of 2019, 93% of the spending in climate change mitigation and adaptation studies and projects has been cut. In Brazil, in 2020, less than $400,000 was invested in such studies and projects. It's sorry for this word, it's a ridiculous value. Consider the importance of Brazil, the size of the country. This value means nothing, almost nothing, in terms of building better policy, or build new policy, or build policy to fight again, to mitigate climate change and also adaptate climate change. Between 2019 and 2020, more than 2,000 square kilometers were deforested, mainly in the Amazon, but not only in the Amazon. It's important to highlight that deforestation in Brazil occurs also in, for example, in Pantanal and, for example, Atlantic forest. And other biomes, of course, not only Caatinga, Cerrado, are equivalent to this kind of deforestation of 13 cities of São Paulo, only 2 years. Even this not the environmentally productive context, days ago, 3, 4, 5 days ago, during COP26 in Scotland, the country set to the road that will be eliminate illegal deforestation by 2028, before the previous 2030, before the last COP, and announced a 50% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030. I hope so, also, of course, but I don't know. It's not so easy to believe how will to be implemented, looking for the recent data in Brazil, and also to looking for the where is the policy, the money for to build them and implement policies. The priority can be another one, because where is the priority looking for this reduction in spending climate change mitigation and studying project? 93% since 2019. I don't agree, and okay. Poverty and climate change main impact for the Latin American poor people, and also for biodiversity, for example, present in Amazon rainforest. A very recent report produced by the World Bank showed for us that more than 70 million Latin Americans are at risk of being displaced by the effects of climate change by 2050, the equivalent of entire population of the country, Equator country. According to, as I told you, Latin America, for example, this so important figure showing residents abandoning their homes after a hurricane in Nicaragua on November of last year. Very common to find this situation, for example, in Caribbean, other countries, Brazil. This kind of region of the globe is so relevant in terms of climate change because of the presence of a high biodiversity and poverty. Most important part of a percent population in the Latin American countries are poor, so vulnerable to climate change and vulnerable to COVID-19 and future pandemics. Bad news is very probable to humanity will fight, very probably to fight the future pandemics. Continue this not so reasonable relation between human activities and nature and environment. The strong interrelationship between poverty and COVID-19 in Brazil. The coronavirus is seriously punishing the most vulnerable population in the city of São Paulo. A very recent and consistent study showed, focused in the city of São Paulo, focused that blacks and residents of the city's poorest neighborhoods are at greater risk of contracting COVID-19. That, while a Brazilian reality in big cities, Brazilian big cities, megalopolis, the data show that in the poorest neighborhoods of the city of São Paulo, the coronavirus contamination is 2.5 times greater than in the rich neighborhoods. This study also indicates the trouble of the difference between black and white here in Brazil, that the black population is hardest hit by the pandemic. Among whites, 7.9 were positive for COVID-19. Among blacks, this rate was almost 20%. Terrible situation. In Brazil, poor workers and centrally the poor and blacks are much more exposed to the COVID-19 because they have to work without possibilities of home office. Home office is not a possibility for them. They have to use public transport and often don't have access to clean products. This makes them more vulnerable, of course. As a so important specialist, Ratnika Bynum, who is still working hard, leading a radical presence group in East London, COVID-19 affects much more people of color who experience far higher infection and death rates than white people. We look at this situation occurring in all since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, here in the state of São Paulo, in the state of Rio de Janeiro, the state of Minas Gerais, in the south. So COVID-19 affects much more poor people and Black people. Not only Brazil, of course. There is a very strong interrelationship between poverty and climate change impact. Many studies show this. In the state when we find high income, you can find a low level of effects and consequences of climate change on poverty. Poverty in Brazil is completely connected with effects of climate change. Reduce poverty is an important and relevant strategy to reduce the impact of climate change in our country. And of course, in the world, the same situation, similar situation, but the situation is very reality in global South. Brazil is a very important representative country in global South context. Sorry, another graph in Portuguese, but it's important. I will translate very quickly. COVID-19 makes Brazil more unequal, poor, and unhappy. The pandemic here in Brazil reduced the income, improve the number of employment. Employment in Brazil is great number, big number nowadays. But I will just try to translate, sorry, in Portuguese, but Brazil in red and road average in green. If you look for example, stress compared to 2019, 2020, sadness, angry, so you can see clearly that the situation, if you feel happy, the situation changing, the last column here, you can find the situation of Brazil, of course, very clear, who is studying the context of the Brazilian context in terms of COVID-19. COVID-19 makes Brazilian population more unequal, Brazil more unequal, poor, and unhappy compared to the world average. And another terrible situation. Existing socioeconomic inequalities rather than age, health status, and other risk factors for COVID-19 have affected the course of the pandemic, with a different adverse burden on states and municipalities with high socioeconomic vulnerability. Spatial distribution of socioeconomic vulnerability, COVID-19 health risks, hospital capacity, and COVID-19 death rates. The income in Brazil, the GDP in Brazil is concentrated in few hands. In Brazil, we can see very clear an equal country, and Latin America is one of the most unequal regions globally. But Brazil responds for an important role in this contest. You can find in this ranking, Brazil responds for a not so good position in terms of inequality. Brazil is the inequality here is connected with the Brazilian history. Since the beginning of the Brazilian Republic in the end of the 19th century, Brazil continues the trouble of the inequality. Need to face really and reduce, because reduce the inequality, reduce poverty means reduce the vulnerability of our entire population in terms of future pandemic, or the current pandemic, and also, of course, climate change impacts. Average monthly salary, you can see the trouble of the difference between income, the salary, white people comparing with Black people, and men and women's trouble. The difference is very clear, and change the situation, brings equality, means at the same time better a society more resilient against future pandemics and the consequence of climate change. The necessary path to mitigate climate change and COVID-19, very probably also future pandemics, to build a new socio-political and economic system, reduce social and economic inequalities, mainly in the global south, reduce the concentration of richness in the hands of a minority, and at the same time, improve the equality in terms of income and opportunities to health access, to education access, to sustainable transport system. This is our conclusions, but I'd like to highlight that sensitivity to others and the real decision to act and protect not only on self, but also the people around is an issue that is not limited to climate change alone. The same principles, the same ideas, the same behavior are at play, for example, in the solution in fighting against COVID-19 and maybe future pandemics, the same strategy, the same way of understanding the existence, which is also global in scope, despite these two crises acting very different time scales. There's a big, a very interesting, very big issue. We need to understand the different time scales, and we need to build strategies combining fight the troubles, future pandemics, the current pandemics, and climate change. Climate change will be with the humanity during the next decades. And COVID-19, maybe science is doing a good job in terms of producing new vaccination process. On the other hand, there is no doubt that the solution to climate change and COVID-19 essentially depends on ethical values such as altruism and a sense of collectivity. This graph is so resume my thinking about how to fight against the pandemics and at the same time climate change. Those who contribute to the least greenhouse gas will be the most impacted by climate change. The CO2 emission per capita, we can see clearly the situation opposite in terms of vulnerability to climate change. We can see the situation in terms of climate change and COVID-19. If you look to the global south, and if you look for the Brazilian context, we need to change the situation, bring more equality, bring everybody to fight together with this trouble, but a high responsibility and high role and high participation, high money, looking for developed countries, industrialized countries. But everybody needs to do the best against these troubles. Even in this so difficult political moment, not only in Brazil, of course, we, science, civil society, conscious policymakers, won't give up, fight against the consequences and causes of climate change and the pandemic of COVID-19. And there are many voices inspiring us, for example, our so great Martin Luther King. I love this phrase. Even if I knew that tomorrow the road would go to pieces, I would still plant my apple tree. The history of this man, his examples, his history, his life. So to reflect, of course. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much.